When we trace the evolution of the idea that God had fallen silent about 4 centuries before the birth of Jesus, we realize that it's actually those who worked against the fulfillment of God's purposes that came up with the idea. And eventually it gets expressed quite overtly in rabbinic texts of the 2nd century AD. And those particular texts are deliberately trying to counter Christian claims. That is, Jesus could not possibly have been the Messiah or even a prophetic figure because God stopped sending prophets well before Jesus was born, 4 centuries before, in fact. And yet, ironically, Christians have continued proliferating this idea that God fell silent. It's an anti-Christian polemic that we continue to proclaim from our pulpits. I think it's time that we laid the idea aside and actually looked at the biblical and historical evidence to see that God was anything but silent during these 4 centuries. I wrote this book mainly for my students who every year in my classroom wanted to know the one book that they could go to understand the entire postexilic period from the late 6th century BC all the way to the birth of Jesus. And it was very hard to find one book that did that. I could point them to multiple different resources, but never just one book. So I wanted to put all of the history of this period and the theological developments of this period into one particular book. I would love for people to read the book from cover to cover. It's written so that it can be read that way. But it's also the kind of thing that you can pull off the shelf to use as a reference work alongside other resources. And in telling the story of these centuries, we're illuminating some things that most Christians just don't know about. Because Christians tend to assume that these are silent years, they generally don't know what happened during those years, and so they don't stop to ask questions about them. I want them now to ask questions, and obviously I want them to have the answers. So I'm hoping that the book becomes a framework for understanding what God did during these centuries and understanding what biblical literature arose during these centuries, and in that way actually joining some of the dots that would otherwise not be joined. So, for example, how is it that at the beginning of the post-exilic period we have people who are getting right behind Zerubbabel, the Davidic descendant, to try and rebuild the temple and re-establish a Davidic kingdom, and yet when we get to the New Testament, the Davidic royal family are nowhere near the corridors of power. They're just tradesmen up in Galilee. How did we get there? How do we get from having Davidic leadership to having priests in leadership over the Jewish nation? And there are so many other developments that we don't stop to ask, how did these happen? And how do they relate to what God was doing before that time? For many people, the 5 centuries before Jesus are a huge enigma, largely because we think 4 of those centuries were silent. But they were anything but silent. I would love for you to read this book and see what God was actually doing with his covenant people during these centuries as he led them to the fulfillment of his purposes in Jesus.